A Japanese sword is one of several types of traditionally made swords from Japan. Swords have been made from Kofun period, and generally Japanese swords are the ones after the Heian period having curves. And there are many types of Japanese swords that differ by size, shape, field of application and method of manufacture. Some of the more commonly known types of Japanese swords are the katana, wakizashi, and tachi types. The type classifications for Japanese swords indicate the combination of a blade and its mounts, as this then determines the style of use of the blade. An unsigned and shortened blade that was once made and intended for use as a tachi may be alternately mounted in tachi oshiri and katana koshiri. It is properly distinguished, then, by the style of mount it currently inhabits. A long tanto may be classified as a wakizashi due to its length being over 30 centimeters. However, it may have originally been mounted and used as a tanto, making the length distinction somewhat arbitrary but necessarily when referring to unmounted short blades. When the mounts are taken out of the equation, a tanto and wakizashi will be determined by length under or over 30 centimeters unless their intended use can be absolutely determined. The speaker is rendering an opinion on the intended use of the blade. In this way, a blade formerly attributed as a wakizashi due to length may be informally discussed between individuals as a tanto because the blade was made during an age where tanto were popular and the wakizashi as a companion sword to katana did not yet exist. The following are types of Japanese swords: chokuto, a straight single-edged sword that was produced prior to the 10th century and without differential hardening or folding. Tsurugi-ken, a straight two-edged sword that was produced prior to the 10th century and may be without differential hardening or folding. Tachi, a sword that is generally longer and more curved than the later katana, with curvature centered from the middle towards the tang, and often including the tang. Tachi were worn suspended with the edge downward. The tachi was in vogue before the 15th century. Kodachi, a shorter version of the tachi, but with similar mounts and intended use, mostly found in the 13th century or earlier. Odachi, nodachi, very large tachi, some in excess of 100 centimeters, and usually a blade of the late 14th century. Uchigatana, a development from the tachi in the 15th century, worn with the edge upwards in the obi. Katituchi, a short type of uchigatana developed in the 16th century, with short tang, intended for one-handed use. One of the forerunners of the wakizashi, katana, a general term for the traditional sword with a curved blade longer than 60 centimeters, worn with the edge upwards in the sash, developed from the uchigatana and the sword of the samurai class of the Edo period. Wakizashi, a general term for a sword between 1 and 2 shaku long, predominantly made after 1600. Generally it is the short blade that accompanies a katana in the traditional samurai daisho pairing of swords, but may be worn by classes other than the samurais of single blade, also worn edge up as the katana. It should be noted that there are bladed weapons made in the same traditional manner as other Japanese swords, and they are also considered to be swords. These include nagamaki, a polearm similar to a naginata, but with a straighter blade, more like that of a tachi or katana, and mounted with a wrapped handle similar to a highly exaggerated katana handle. The name refers to the style of mount as well as a blade type, which means that a naginata blade could be mounted in a nagamaki mount and be considered a nagamaki. Naginata, a polearm with a curved single-edged blade. Naginata mounts consist of a long wooden pole, different from a nagamaki mount, which is shorter and wrapped. Yari, a spear or spear-like polearm. Yari have various blade forms, from a simple double-edged and flat blade, to a triangular cross-section double-edged blade, to those with a symmetric crosspiece or those with an asymmetric crosspiece. The main blade is symmetric and straight unlike a naginata, and usually smaller but can be as large or bigger than some naginata blades. Tanto, a knife or dagger, usually one-edged, but some were double-edged, though asymmetrical. Ken, usually a tanto or wakizashi length religious ceremonial blade, with a gentle leaf shape and point, but some may be larger and can also refer to old pre-curved types of swords as above. Symmetrical and double-edged. Arrowheads for war, ujiri, were also made using the same methods as Japanese swords were. Description: the production of swords in Japan is divided into time periods: Jokoto, Koto, Shinto, Shinto, Genda-ito, Shinsakuto. In modern times, the most commonly known type of Japanese sword is the shinaji-zukuri katana, which is a single-edged and usually curved longsword traditionally worn by samurai from the 15th century onwards. Other types of Japanese swords include Tsurugi-ken, which is a double-edged sword, tachi, which are older styles of a very long single-edged sword, wakizashi, a medium-sized sword, and tanto, which is an even smaller knife-sized sword. Naginata and yari, despite being polearms, are still considered to be swords. Japanese swords are still commonly seen today. Antique and modern forged swords can easily be found and purchased. Modern, authentic nihonto are made by a few hundred swordsmiths. Many examples can be seen at an annual competition hosted by the All Japan Swordsmith Association, under the auspices of the Nihonto Bunker Shinko Kyokai. Western historians have said that Japanese katana were among the finest cutting weapons in world military history. Etymology: the word katana was used in ancient Japan and is still used today, whereas the old usage of the word nihonto is found in the poem, The Song of Nihonto, by the Song dynasty per Tu Yang Xiu. The word nihonto became more common in Japan in the late Tokugawa shogunate. Due to importation of Western swords, the word nihonto was adopted in order to distinguish it from the Western sword. Meibutsu is a special designation given to sword masterpieces which are listed in a compilation from the 18th century called the Kyoho Meibutsucho. The swords listed are koto blades from several different provinces. 100 of the 166 swords listed are known to exist today, with soshu blades being very well represented. The Kyoho Meibutsucho also listed the nicknames, prices, history and length of the Meibutsu with swords by Yoshimitsu, Masamune, Yoshihiro, and Sadamune being very highly priced. Anatomy: blade. Each blade has a unique profile, mostly dependent on the swordsmith and the construction method. The most prominent part is the middle ridge, or shinaji. In the earlier picture, the examples were flat to the shinaji, then tapering to the blade. However, swords could narrow down to the shinaji, then narrow further to the blade, or even expand outward towards the shinaji then shrink to the blade. A flat narrowing shinaji is called shinaji hikushi, whereas a fat blade is called a shinaji takushi. The shinaji can be placed near the back of the blade for a longer, sharper, more fragile tip, or a more moderate shinaji near the center of the blade. The sword also has an exact tip shape, which is considered an extremely important characteristic. The tip can be long, medium, short, or even hooked backwards. In addition, whether the front edge of the tip is more curved or straight is also important. The kisaki is not a chisel-like point, nor is the Western knife interpretation of a tanto point found on true Japanese swords. A straight, linearly sloped point has the advantage of being easier to grind designed, but it bears only a superficial similarity to traditional Japanese kisaki. Kisaki have a curved profile, and smooth three-dimensional curvature across the surface towards the edge, though they are bounded by a straight line called the yokote and have crisp definition at all their edges. Although it is not commonly known, the chisel point kisaki originated in Japan. Examples of such are shown in the book The Japanese Sword by Kanzen Sato. Because American bladesmiths use this design extensively, it is a common misconception that the design originated in America. A hole is punched through the tang nakagard, called a mekugi-ana. It is used to anchor the blade using a mekugi, a small bamboo pin that is inserted into another cavity in the handle suka and through the mekugi-ana, thus restricting the blade from slipping out. To remove the handle, one removes the mekugi. The swordsmith's signature mei is carved on the tang mountings. In Japanese, the scabbard is referred to as a saya, and the handguard piece, often intricately designed as an individual work of art, especially in later years of the Edo period, was called the tsuba. Other aspects of the mountings, such as the menuki, habaki, fuchi and kashira, kazuka, kagai, sayalaka and suka ito, received similar levels of artistry. Signature and date. The mei is the signature inscribed onto the tang of the Japanese sword. Fake signatures are common not only due to centuries of forgeries but potentially misleading ones that acknowledge prominent smiths and guilds, and those commissioned to a separate signer. Sword scholars collect and study ashigata, or paper tang rubbings, taken from a blade. To identify the mei, the hilt is removed and the sword is held point side up. The mei is chiseled onto the tang on the side which traditionally faces away from the wearer's body while being worn, since the katana and wakizashi are always worn with the cutting edge up. The edge should be held to the viewer's left. The inscription will be viewed as kanji on the surface of the tang. The first two kanji represent the province, the next pair is the smith, and the last, when present, is sometimes a variation of made by or respectfully. The date will be inscribed near the mei, either with the reign name, the zodiacal method, or those calculated from the reign of the legendary emperor Jimmu, dependent upon the period. Classification. Length. What generally differentiates the different swords is the length. Japanese swords are measured in units of shaku. Since 1891, the modern Japanese shaku is approximately equal to a foot, calibrated with the meter to equal exactly 10 meters per 33 shaku. However, the historical shaku was slightly longer. Thus, there may sometimes be confusion about the blade lengths, depending on which shaku value is being assumed when converting to metric U.S. customary measurements. The three main divisions of Japanese blade length are 1 shaku or less for tanto, 1 to 2 shaku for shoto, 2 shaku or more for daito. A blade shorter than 1 shaku is considered a tanto. A blade longer than 1 shaku but less than 2 is considered a shoto. The wakizashi and kodachi are in this category. The length is measured in a straight line across the back of the blade from tip to munemachi. Most blades that fall into the shoto size range are wakizashi. However, some daito were designed with blades slightly shorter than 2 shaku. These were called kodachi and are somewhere in between a true daito and a wakizashi. A shoto and a daito together are called a daisho. The daisho was the symbolic armament of the Edo period samurai. A blade longer than 2 shaku is considered a daito, or long sword. To qualify as a daito, the sword must have a blade longer than 2 shaku in a straight line. While there is a well-defined lower limit to the length of a daito, the upper limit is not well enforced. A number of modern historians, swordsmiths, etc., say that swords that are over 3 shaku in blade length are longer than normal daito, and are usually usually referred to are called odachi. The word daito is often used when explaining the related terms shoto and daisho. Miyamoto Musashi refers to the long sword in the Book of Five Rings. He is referring to the katana in this, and refers to the nodachi and the odachi as extra long swords. Before about 1500, most swords were usually worn suspended from cords on a belt, edge down. This style is called jindachi zukuri, and daito worn in this fashion are called tachi. From 1600 to 1867, more swords were worn through an obi, paired with a smaller blade, both worn edge-up. This style is called bukuzukuri, and all daito worn in this fashion are katana, averaging 70 to 74 centimeters in blade length. However, nihonto of longer lengths also existed, including lengths up to 78 centimeters. It was not simply that the swords were worn by cords on a belt, as a style of swords. Such a statement trivializes an important function of such a manner of bearing the sword. It was a very direct example of form-following function. At this point in Japanese history, much of the warfare was fought on horseback. Being so, if the sword or blade were in a more vertical position, it would be cumbersome and awkward to draw. Suspending the sword by cords allowed the sheath to be more horizontal, and far less likely to bind while drawing it in that position. Abnormally long blades, usually carried across the back, are called odachi or nodachi. The word odachi is also sometimes used as a synonym for nihonto. Odachi means great sword, and nodachi translates to field sword. These great swords were used during war as the longer sword gave a foot soldier a reach advantage. These swords are now illegal in Japan. Citizens are not allowed to possess an odachi unless it is for ceremonial purposes. Here is a list of lengths for different types of blades. Nodachi, odachi, jintachi, 90 cm and over. Tachi, katana, over 60.6 cm. Wakizashi, between 30.3 and 60.6 cm. Tanto, ikuchi, under 30.3 centimeters. Blades whose length is next to a different classification type are described with a prefix o or ko, e.g. a wakizashi with a length of 59 centimeters is called an o wakizashi, whereas a katana with 61 centimeters is called a ko katana. Since 1867, restrictions and/or the deconstruction of the samurai class meant that most blades have been worn jindachi zukuri style, like Western Navy officers. Since 1953, there has been a resurgence in the bukuzukuri style, permitted only for demonstration purposes. Most old Japanese swords can be traced back to one of 5 provinces, each of which had its own school, traditions, and trademarks. These schools are known as kokaden. These traditions and provinces are as follows: Soshu School, known for Ite Mihara and Midori Buhamin in Niideki. Yamato School, known for Masa Mihara and Suguha Hamin in Niideki. Bizen School, known for Moku Mihara and Midori Buhamin in Niideki. Yamashiro School, known for Moku Mihara and Suguha Hamin in Niideki. Mino School, known for hard Moku Mihara and Midori Bu mixed with Togarai Ba. In the Koto era there were several other schools that did not fit within the 5 traditions or were known to mix elements of each kokaden, and they were called wakimono. There were 19 commonly referenced wakimono. History. The production of swords in Japan is divided into specific time periods: Jokoto, Koto, Shinto, Shin-Shinto, Genda-Ito, and Shin-Sakuto. Early history. Early examples of swords were straight Chokuto, Jokoto, and others with unusual shapes. Some of styles and techniques probably are derived from China, and some of them are directly imported through trade. Swords forged between 987 and 1597 are called koto. These are considered the pinnacle of Japanese swordcraft. Early models had uneven curves with the deepest part of the curve at the hilt. As eras changed, the center of the curve tended to move up the blade. The predecessor of the Japanese sword has been called Warabite sword. It had been manufactured by Emiishi persons in Tohoku region. In the middle of the Heian period, samurai improved on the Warabite to develop Kenukagata tachi, early Japanese sword. The Japanese sword known today with its deep, graceful curve has its origin in Shinaji-zukuri tachi, which were developed sometime around the middle of the Heian period to service the need of the growing military class. Its shape reflects the changing form of warfare in Japan. Cavalry were now the predominant fighting unit, and the older straight shokuto were particularly unsuitable for fighting from horseback. The curved sword is a far more efficient weapon when wielded by a warrior on horseback, where the curve of the blade adds considerably to the downward force of a cutting action. The tachi is a sword which is generally larger than the katana and is worn suspended with the cutting edge down. This was the standard form of carrying the sword for centuries, and would eventually be displaced by the katana style, where the blade was worn thrust through the belt edge up. The tachi was worn slung across the left hip. The signature on the tang of the blade was inscribed in such a way that it would always be on the outside of the sword when worn. This characteristic is important in recognizing the development, function, and different styles of wearing swords from this time onwards. When worn with full armor, the tachi would be accompanied by a shorter blade in the form known as koshigatana, a type of short sword with no handguard, and where the hilt and scabbard meet to form the style of mounting called an ikuchi. Daggers were also carried for close combat fighting, as well as carried generally for personal protection. The Mongol invasions of Japan in the 13th century spurred further evolution of the Japanese sword, often forced to abandon traditional mounted archery for hand-to-hand combat. Many samurai found that the swords were too delicate and prone to damage when used against the thick leather armor of the invaders. In response, Japanese swordsmiths started to adopt thinner and simpler temper lines. Certain Japanese swordsmiths of this period began to make blades with thicker backs and bigger points as a response to the Mongol threat. By the 15th century, the Sengoku Jidai civil war erupted, and the vast need for swords together with the ferocity of the fighting caused the highly artistic techniques of the Kamakura period to be abandoned in favor of more utilitarian and disposable weapons. The export of Nihonto reached its height during the Muromachi period, when at least 200,000 swords were shipped to Ming Dynasty China in official trade in an attempt to soak up the production of Japanese weapons and make it harder for pirates in the area to arm. In the 15th and 16th centuries, samurai who increasingly found a need for a sword for use in closer quarters, along with increasing use of foot soldiers armed with spears, led to the creation of the uchigatana, in both one-handed and two-handed forms. As the Sengoku civil wars progressed, the uchigatana evolved into the modern katana, and replaced the tachi as the primary weapon of the samurai, especially when not wearing armor. Many longer tachi were shortened in the 15th–17th centuries to meet the demand for katana. The craft decayed as time progressed and firearms were introduced as a decisive force on the battlefield. At the end of the Muromachi period, the Tokugawa shoguns issued regulations controlling who could own and carry swords, and effectively standardized the description of a nihonto. New swords in times of of peace, swordsmiths returned to the making of refined and artistic blades, and the beginning of the Momoyama period saw the return of high-quality creations, as the techniques of the ancient smiths had been lost during the previous period of war. These swords were called Shinto, literally new swords. Generally they are considered inferior to most koto, and coincide with a decline in manufacturing skills. As the Edo period progressed, blade quality declined, though ornamentation was refined. Originally, simple and tasteful engravings known as horomono were added for religious reasons. Later, in the more complex work found on many Shinto, form no longer strictly followed function. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, sword-making and the use of firearms declined. The master swordsmith Suishin Masahide published opinions that the arts and techniques of the Shinto swords were inferior to the koto blades, and that research should be made by all swordsmiths to rediscover the lost techniques. Masahide traveled the land teaching what he knew to all who would listen, and swordsmiths rallied to his cause and ushered in a second renaissance in Japanese swordsmithing, with the discarding of the Shinto style and the reintroduction of old and rediscovered techniques. Swords made in the koto style between 1761 and 1876 are Shinto, new revival swords, or literally new swords. These are considered superior to most Shinto, but inferior to true koto. The arrival of Matthew Perry in 1853 and the subsequent convention of Kanagawa forcibly reintroduced Japan to the outside world. The rapid modernization of the Meiji Restoration soon followed. The Heian Edict in 1876 all but banned carrying swords and guns on streets. Overnight, the market for swords died. Many swordsmiths were left without a trade to pursue, and valuable skills were lost. The nihonto remained in use in some occupations such as the police force. At the same time, kendo was incorporated into police training so that police officers would have at least the training necessary to properly use one. In time, it was rediscovered that soldiers needed to be armed with swords, and over the decades at the beginning of the 20th century swordsmiths again found work. These swords, derisively called gunto, were often oil-tempered, or simply stamped out of steel and given a serial number rather than a chiseled signature. The mass-produced ones often look like Western cavalry sabers rather than nihonto, with blades slightly shorter than blades of the Shinto and Shin-Shinto periods. Military swords handmade in the traditional way are often termed as genda-ito. The craft of making swords was kept alive through the efforts of a few individuals, notably Gasan Sadakazu and Gasan Sadakatsu, who were employed as imperial artisans. These smiths produced fine works that stand with the best of the older blades for the emperor and other high-ranking officials. The students of Sadakatsu went on to be designated intangible cultural assets, living national treasures, as they embodied knowledge that was considered to be fundamentally important to the Japanese identity. In 1934, the Japanese government issued a military specification for the Shin-Gunto, the first version of which was the Type 94 katana, and many machine and handcrafted swords used in World War II conformed to this and later Shin-Gunto specifications.